Welcome to episode 4 of the Think Tank podcast, brought to you by the Digital Innovation Group at Providence Health. Think Tank is a supercharged brainstorming session between two leaders from different verticals to help us solve some of healthcare's biggest challenges. This is Kelly Stonelake. Thank you for joining us. Today, we'll be discussing what makes a successful digital incubator and the unique challenges and opportunities we're facing in innovation. Joining us today is Aaron Martin, Providence Health's Chief Digital Officer, and Julie Sandler, who is the Managing Director at Pioneer Square Labs. Pioneer Square Labs is a startup studio and venture capital fund that invests in founders with passion and heart who are building tech-driven, industry-shaping businesses all over the Pacific Northwest. Welcome, Aaron and Julie, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Aaron, you joined Providence Health from Amazon to lead the Digital Innovation Group, which identifies the biggest problems in healthcare that are addressable through a digital solution. Super interesting jump, and really curious to hear more about what you're doing. I mean, it seems to me from what I've learned about the Digital Innovation Group that you identify a problem and then look to the market. You're providing support, technical infrastructure, trial, and then rapid adoption of these new technologies from innovative companies. You also build products internally where it makes most sense. I'm really excited to talk about that. And on top of it all, Providence Health operates a $300 million venture fund as the strategic arm of the Digital Innovation Group. From the outside, this kind of seems like a deconstructed incubator of sorts. Would you agree? Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, I think so. I've been working with Providence now for 6 years, and the concept has obviously evolved. I wish, kind of walking in, we had all this kind of worked out, and of course we brought on some really, really smart people who kind of thought through what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and the uniqueness of healthcare. And one of the things that we've kind of put together is, healthcare is awash in very big opportunities that are kind of like, picking watermelons off the ground, if you will. I mean, we're not, by any means on a digital basis, kind of sharpening a fine edge on the sword at this point. We're still kind of hitting pretty big problems, and a lot of those have been kind of exposed through the latest kind of COVID crisis in terms of the structural issues that we've got in healthcare. And so what the team does, to your point, Kelly, is they go and they find what we call needle movers, things that really matter in healthcare. And then we go through a very kind of rigorous process of step one: do we already own a solution to the problem? Because believe it or not, when I came into healthcare, you wouldn't believe how many times, we were purchasing technology for something that we already kind of, to solve a problem that, we already had an existing vendor that did that, right? So there's a lot of duplication, and that goes to kind of like how health systems tend to be kind of, are moving to much more of an operating model and less of a federated model. And so there was a lot of kind of disjointed activity going on. So the first thing is do we already have the solution? And the second is, if we don't have the solution, can we find it already in the market? And so that's where Providence Ventures comes in, and they go out and scour the market looking for what's typically early stage companies, but not all the time, to solve that specific problem. And then sometimes we invest in those companies. Sometimes we don't. It just depends on the terms, or the terms right. So if we don't have it and we can't find it, then as a last resort, we'll build it. And the reason why I say as a last resort is we have 120 people here on the team. Most of them come from Amazon and Microsoft, and a product and engineering team that build these new products. And once you've built something, you kind of own it forever, right? And that goes to our commercialization model, so that we not only build it, but we build it for the purposes of spinning it out. Because, we have 120 people, but I can't ever imagine us going up to, say, 2,000 engineers or something like that. We couldn't afford it as a health system. And so what that means is when we come up with a solvable problem and we're building kind of a roadmap for it, it's how we scale the roadmaps. We spin them out into separate companies. We get them funded. We get them additional, customers, great leadership teams, and they go and prosecute that roadmap. And it came from kind of a lesson that we learned observing the industry, which is there's a lot of EMRs that have been kind of ripped out, for instance, that were built by health systems early on in the EMR kind of phase of things. And the reason is because, it's incredibly hard not to prosecute a roadmap indefinitely as in a corporate innovation scenario. If you're not an all technology company like Microsoft or Amazon or Google, it's really hard to kind of maintain these roadmaps indefinitely. Your priorities shift, or they get more expensive, et cetera. So it's much better to put it in the context of a company is our thinking on the subject.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you tell us, what does EMR mean?
Oh, sorry. Electronic medical record. So I'm going to get all, yeah. So it's kind of like the ERP for healthcare is the way to, which it means something. I'll stop using acronyms like that.
Well, my unofficial role here is asking what acronyms mean, which I can do. I can serve that purpose quite well. Aaron, how does Providence Ventures help Providence overall fulfill its mission?
That's a great question. So a little bit of background on Providence Ventures. It's a $300 million venture fund, of which we've probably invested close to $100 million over the past 5 years. So we're a little bit kind of, almost a third or halfway through it. And we're going to be investing over a 10-year period. So you're looking at probably, anywhere in any given year, investing maybe $20 or $30 million on average. And how it supports our mission is very, very critical. And the first thing is that, it helps us align our priorities with small tech companies who are the innovators in the market. And it really helps us bring to the table not only our guidance as an important potential customer and a contributor to their product. So we do a lot of advice in terms of advising at a board level to the CEOs of these companies. They're thinking about, should I build this feature? Should I go this direction or that direction? And we can give them some really great feedback from a health system perspective by putting them in touch with a lot of our clinicians and our operators who are kind of the domain experts. So that is an important part of what we do. And then the result of that is we have more innovation that serves the industry, the provider side of the industry. And also the other part of it too is it also helps us make sure that we're guiding these technology companies to serve the entire market. So as you know, a big part of Providence's mission is to serve everyone, especially the poor and vulnerable. And so we always have a voice at the table in terms of technology innovation to make sure that we're not just thinking about, a small group of kind of digitally enabled consumers. We're thinking about the entire market and how we can serve it better. So to kind of recap, it is, over a 10-year period, probably $300 million that we'll be investing. But the more important point is guiding the industry around innovation that will help serve our patients and making sure that it's serving the entire spectrum of patients that we feel called to serve as an organization, everyone. So especially the poor and vulnerable.
I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, I've spent a lot of time personally in the investment space as an angel investor, and I'm a partner to seed fund. But the concept of how this works within healthcare is new to me, and I think will be new to a lot of our listeners, and it's pretty fascinating. And why I'm really excited to have you and Julie here together is understanding what are some of the common challenges and also differences between running a healthcare incubator and a digital incubator. So Julie, as I'm a huge fan of Pioneer Square Labs, and I'm familiar with you and your work, and definitely having a little bit of a fangirl moment myself right now. And, I knew you when you were a partner at Madrona, and I would love to hear a little bit about what drew you from Madrona, which, here in Seattle, I would say is, the premier venture firm, into an opportunity like Pioneer Square Labs 3 years ago. I'm curious what drew you there, and then how Pioneer Square Labs has changed since you joined 3 years ago.
Well, first of all, thanks for such nice feedback about PSL and generally, and right back at you. For me, as both a Northwest gal and also a bit of a tech geek, the idea of taking the experiences that I had in pure venture and applying them to a never before seen style platform here in the region that actually empowers local entrepreneurs to not just fund companies, but build them in really innovative, scrappy, compelling ways was really exciting. It helped a lot that the founding team at PSL were all my former partners, and many of them anyway were my former partners, and had worked with them for years and years before coming over. Just over 3 years ago. The organization itself is about 4 years old. Since then, you asked what's changed. We've raised about $30 million into the studio that now funds a full-time team of 20 something engineers, designers, data scientists, product people, marketers, ops, finance, recruiters, all the kind of core components that are super helpful, especially over those first couple of years as you're figuring things out as a founder. The studio, the incubation side, as it were, has spun out now over 20 companies that have been backed by third-party VCs, third-party investors, have generated, I think, over hundreds of millions of dollars in company value, and just a really nice diverse set of categories. Certainly, we've got some in healthcare, classic enterprise, consumer. That 35% of our companies are founded by women founders. And I think that's in large part just a reflection of general diversity that we have across our team and across our group of investors and stakeholders, but just diversity of experience too. It's been exciting to work with a team at this scale that brings so many different industries and skill sets to bear as we work with founders. The other thing that's changed is the fact that we, have this new venture fund that I spend most of my time leading. It's our inaugural fund, $80 million. That's really focused at the very beginning of these founder journeys, pre-seed, seed, Series A style investing. And the neat thing about it too is that every member of the broader PSL team that I mentioned, all those data scientists and engineers, everybody has very meaningful upside, both spiritually and economically, to the venture fund as well. So we treat it as this holistic platform whereby if you're a founder and you want to work with us, it doesn't really matter if you're more interested in incubation or in a more classic VC relationship. All of us want to rally around your company and help you achieve, in theory, what no one else has achieved before.
That's amazing. What an incredible resource. And both of you are playing these amazing roles in running digital incubators here in Seattle. I'd love to discuss what it's like setting up and running a digital incubator. What are some of the analogous challenges across your businesses? Let's start with incubation models. Do these tend to be different? How long are you baking your portfolio companies? Would love to kick off a conversation about that.
Maybe to help kind of understand the similarities and differences, I can talk about some of the traits that we think have benefited us in setting up and running, our studio side. One, I think a willingness to deal with a lot of ambiguity and a lot of failure. I think that in a given day, like we are all, perhaps as human beings, but certainly in the innovation side, going to fail multiple times. And the ability to look at failures as success is a really important ingredient of this. And as an example, we'll work in a course of a given year on anywhere from like 50 to 80 different company concepts, really seriously, where we're spending resources and time and engaging. But of, say, every 10 of those concepts, we are going to ruthlessly kill 9 of them, which means that in the course of that year, we're really probably only going to spin out and work with somewhere between 5 to 8 companies after all of that time and money and heartache spent. And so a willingness to be not only test and experiment minded, but willing to walk away and not get overly emotionally attached to concepts that just aren't performing, that aren't generating compelling results, is a really important skill set. That also connects to the notion of scrappiness, and how do you do this really cost effectively? How do you manage time well, especially when you've got a multidisciplinary team that all bring different strengths to bear? How do you figure out who does what? And that question becomes even more important when you think about how you engage with a founder who, in the end, if the company is successful and spins out and raises money, you're going to need to work really closely with to figure out how do I, one, provide that person a lot of support, but not get in the way, allow her or him to build that company out, to build that full-time team out without us sort of intervening or overstepping on process or even cultural matters.
Yeah, for us, it's a little bit it's a little bit harder because it's harder for in healthcare to do rapid experimentation, and there's a whole number of different reasons for that. One is the regulatory environment prohibits a lot of this to protect patients, for instance, or there may be laws around that would restrict certain things you could do in, say, in a consumer kind of incubator context to test signal to noise around around an idea or a concept. Second thing is a very expert driven system, and so a lot of times if you've got somebody who's like, say, for instance, a non-clinical entrepreneur, they've got to really start working very closely with clinicians to understand the feasibility of the idea. And so those are kind of the two biggest kind of differences. And so we have a much more curated list of so we it's kind of Jay-Z esque, but we did this whole kind of refresh before COVID, and we're doing it again after COVID of the top problems that we think we have as a health system where there may be a digital opportunity, and it's very Jay-Z because we ended up with 99. Uh, you know, and and I'm thinking about getting T-shirts printed or something. But the but then it's like it's just probably an anathema to what Julia experiences, because then we can't. It's really hard for us to kind of go and do kind of little experiments with these, right? And so what we have to do instead is we do much more of a kind of an in-depth kind of study of them and try to kind of size them. And then what I would say is that once we start working a problem, we tend to pivot much more into the problem versus just say, "Yeah, there's no opportunity here," right? Because at least by that point, we're pretty sure there's a big economic challenge. We may not have the problem or the solution, but we definitely have a team kind of working on a specific problem. And I think that puts us at a couple of different disadvantages. One is it's more likely in Julie's model that they're going to come up with like a game changing kind of disruptive idea, right? That just kind of comes out of nowhere. That's just more out of inspiration of like how can you kind of flip this on its head, because for two reasons: one, we're an incumbent doing innovation, and two, because we're typically taking problems we know we have versus that we're trying to go solve on. We're not kind of creating kind of out of the blue something new. Let's say we're actually looking at a problem that a health system has to solve. That said, it's I would say it's less highs and lows. We have a much lower kill rate, if you will, than what Julie's describing. But because it's much more researched on the front end. But again, the chances that we come out with like something truly transformational out of this incubator is probably lower than what Julie's kind of dealing with, and also we're obviously focused on one sector, which is healthcare in particular, so that we also have a kind of a limited universe that we can innovate in.
It's kind of an amazing thing, though, at the same time, to be able to operate the model that you guys do, Aaron, in the context of a world-renowned health system. Because to your point, I mean, the notion that when you start something, already that it's a problem or a real opportunity, at least for you. And you guys are very impactful and bleeding edge and well regarded in your industry. It's a really interesting leg up, so that maybe you do have a lower kill rate, but I suspect the hit rate that you have, and in light of the organization that you sit within, it's really powerful. That's something that leads to, well, our lack of that leads to our, sometimes flying blind, which is why all this sort of rapid fire testing and experimentation for both consumer and, B2B models often results in such a high, failure rate, because we don't have the same context, especially when we're tackling a new industry for the first time.
Yeah, if you look at our venture fund, it's interesting. So we were comparing a returns profile to other kind of series A, B kind of investors that kind of invest a little bit early, but not at seed stage, let's say. And our returns are kind of in top quartile. But how we get there relative to a fund that does much more kind of diversified investing is we have many fewer failures, but we also don't have the model of a lot of these big VCs where one investment returns the fund, right, out of say 10 or 20. It's much more it's a lot less. Like I'll give you one statistic. I think we've had 18 investments over the past since we started 3, 4, or 5 years ago, and we've only lost one company so far, which is pretty crazy. But it goes to, when we make an investment, we're pretty sure this is a problem. Now, it may not be something that flies off the shelves, but we're pretty sure there's a market there. So to your point, Julie, but we miss the kids probably.
Yeah, it sounds like in both of your spaces, it's really about honing in that art and science of not only maximizing hit rate, but then making those clients as successful as possible for the market space that they're aiming to fulfill. And it sounds like for you, Aaron, there's so much more data and information and research and specific proven problems identified that can go into informing where you make those investments in the first place. And Julie, I have to imagine that a lot of your founders are building solutions to problems that they experience or perceive or see in the market, but aren't necessarily as tested and proven as you might have in Aaron's world.
Totally. I mean, I actually suspect that one of the strong similarities that sits between, both Aaron's and our world at PSL is the fact that, yeah, you may stumble upon or very deliberately find a powerful idea, powerful opportunity, powerful problem to solve. But in the end, you need to find that person, that human being who is just so uniquely suited to solving it that anyone, whether it's a customer or an employee or an investor, can look at that person and say, yeah, this is probably one of the best people in the world to go and execute against this really wild, disruptive idea. And so I'm gonna want to sign up. I'm gonna want to work for this person. I'm gonna want to invest in this person and partner with this person. If you don't have that, you could do all the testing and experimentation and validation in the world. It's not gonna matter. Ultimately, for both of us, I suspect the who is such a fundamental opportunity and challenge in putting these companies and new concepts together.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. The other thing I would tell you is I'm fortunate enough to be an investor in Julie's group, and so I get an email every month that I look forward to of like all the cool things that they're doing, and the reaction I typically have to these companies is, holy crap, I never thought about that way. Or, that experience does suck. And I think it could be better. Right. So in other words, like they tend to kind of focus on things that like, you have this kind of jarring realization of like, wow, like if you flip that over and think about it totally differently, is there an opportunity? Or, yeah, that I tend to be very tolerant in friction in my life. and, and they'll point out things like like the escrow closing process is really painful. And it's like, yeah, it is, right, and somebody's trying to go fix that. So it's a different, it's like there's different opportunities in there, and it's a different kind of approach.
Cool. Yeah, shifting gears a little bit, I want to dig into something you mentioned, Aaron, which is, how can we not mention COVID-19 and the implications that has on that art and science of not only predicting hit rate and success rate, but also how that impacts the healthcare needs and the consumer needs that we and our founders and partners are solving for. And one thing that I'm particularly super fascinated with right now is the digital acceleration and behavior shifts that we're seeing in light of COVID-19. Things that we thought were coming, but maybe 5 to 10 years away. Like we're seeing Hollywood release movies direct to living room and entire conferences happening in VR. I saw my therapist via Zoom last week, buying a cell phone online, which no one did before, 8% of consumers did before. And both of you are working with companies that are on the cutting edge of digital transformation. And I'd love to hear more about how is this behavior shift happening in your space? How are these behavior shifts impacting your work streams, your portfolio companies? What are you doing differently now? Let's dig into that.
So we were the first health system to see the first confirmed U.S. COVID case in the United States. And so we saw them in Everett. And so we've been working on this issue kind of, very, very closely for what seems like 10 years, but it's in a matter of weeks. So kind of starting in January. And it's really amazing. The thing it's taught me is a couple of things. One is health systems can move as fast as technology companies under extreme circumstances, right? And so Julie and I both worked at Amazon, and one of the things that we used to joke about just as Amazonians is like we treated everything as life and death. So like we were an intense group of people who were, packages that got to be there on time, and or we got to hit this date, or we got to hit this ship date, and that kind of thing. And in this case, it actually was life and death, or it is life and death in terms of getting the technology up and supporting our caregivers. And so a big part of what we were up to as a digital team was to basically provide what I would call, kind of the ultimate PPE, which is, personal protective equipment, which is if you can just keep people from having to go to the site or be seen in person, you're going to lower the possibility, or you're going to eliminate the possibility of an infection, right? And so there were kind of several things we deployed in quick succession. One is obviously an information page, because there's a survey out that most people, their highest degree of a source of truth around something like this is obviously the health system and their physician. And so we wanted to make sure that we're getting accurate information out to them. Second thing was we deployed using our GRACE framework, a self-assessment bot working with Microsoft. And we stood that up in about 4 days. And then the amazing thing is it was actually pretty complex, and the clinical protocols weren't really kind of baked because CDC hadn't come out with them yet. And so we had to work very, very closely with our clinical teams to kind of rapidly iterate that product and launch it. And then we also used our telehealth capability, which we are incubating internally. And I think this goes to this conversation, a company called DexCare. And we saw that platform scale 30x day over day. It was like one day, not a lot of people using it relatively. Next day, everybody in the, kind of across the health system was using it. It was incredibly fast. And the thing I always tell people is, I used to complain to the development team that was working on it, again, a bunch of ex-Amazon folks, why we were overbuilding for scale. You should be focused much more on feature development. And thank God they didn't listen to me. They built the platform to scale very, very quickly. So that worked out. And then the last thing that we deployed working with our clinical teams was at-home monitoring using two of our portfolio companies, Zelth and Twistle. And what they were able to do was if you self-assessed, you went and got a virtual visit, and we found out, you might need to be, you might have COVID, but you're not sick enough to go into the hospital. We need to monitor you at home. So then what would happen is they would get a thermometer and a pulse ox, and the Zelth Twistle solution would ping them 3 times a day and ask them to take a reading. And we could see a huge panel at scale. In some cases, at the peak, I think we were looking at 2,000 patients all in that were monitoring from home. And if we saw somebody start to decompensate, we can then do a video visit, and then if they needed to come in, we could bring them in. And the amazing thing is again, at the beginning of this is that the health system really started to work at the pace of an Amazon very, very quickly, because it was a life and death situation. And the entire organization was pretty much focused on kind of getting one thing right, which is this response to COVID. And it was truly inspiring too, to be a technologist and to have some ability to contribute directly. In the past crises, you kind of are a bystander to all this, and it can be frustrating and demoralizing to see things happen like this. And so it was really, really awesome to support our frontline caregivers and our patients.
It's amazing to reflect on the past 2.5 months for us, because one, I think about just everything that's happened just in our world professionally and as an organization, and it's felt so extreme. And then I compare it to what Aaron just described over the past 2.5 months, and it's mind blowing to think about it. And I know that a big reason that Washington State has done as well as they have in light of the circumstances has been how health systems like Providence have responded and how quickly they've moved, which is mind blowing. So really amazing to hear about that, Aaron. In PSL's world, in terms of your question, how have behavior shifts and changes, impacted our work streams and our portfolio companies? There's two categories that come to mind. One, it's, how have we changed our perception of opportunity as investors? And then I suppose, secondly, there's how have companies, especially early stage companies, been able to respond in light of the impact that this crisis has had on their teams, on their businesses, and on their industries. On the first side, as investors, of course, whenever you see any kind of technological shift, the pure greedy capitalist within you sees opportunity, right? Even more powerfully when it's societal shift, and even more exciting when you expect there to be a response in the market that might lead to more advantageous opportunity or pricing or shifting in how your own investors perceive economic opportunity. So, within that, I think as we've all sort of struggled both professionally and personally to kind of get our feet on the ground and get new rhythms established in our ways of working and living, there's several workflows that we've been certainly getting better at ourselves, but been more intrigued by in terms of the implication for improving the way people live and work. Obviously, with so many different companies being forced into remote work in our industry, opportunities for improved collaboration and connections and facilitating transactions, or even just basic services and education. Those have all become categories that seemingly, over the past, 2.5 months have taken on, renewed interest for us. Portfolio companies that already had value propositions that spoke to those themes, we've really been working hard to help them figure out, how do we counsel you as you adapt to a rapidly changing landscape. We've had a company focused on mental health. You mentioned seeing your therapist remotely. One that's very much focused on families and teenagers, and how they get access to quality care and strong connections. That all of a sudden takes on brand new meaning as we think about the ambiguity around, will schools be in person, or will you be kind of coming and going from your social safety net, for the next generation of students in our country and all over the world. Even content consumption, which we were talking about a little bit earlier, totally has changed. So on one hand, we see a lot of very nice tailwinds around existing themes that we'd been pursuing and building against. We've seen new themes and opportunities emerge as investors that get us intrigued and excited about not only building new companies, but building companies that have really positive impact on the way people live and work. On the other hand, we to the second category, we've had a lot of companies facing just a ton of headwinds all of a sudden. I'd say almost every company that has an enterprise sales cycle, or that has relied on in-person transactions and dynamics to take a product to market, has just experienced unbelievable setbacks, right? Unlike a big company, when you're a startup, you raise enough capital to take you maybe 12 to 18 months before you need to start fundraising again. And a setback of just a few months can be existentially excruciating, if not threatening altogether. And so, working with all of our founders, all of our CEOs on addressing just the different layers of uncertainty has been top of mind. How do you approach operational planning for 2020? Everyone's ops plan that was approved by everyone's board in January been thrown out the window, completely built from scratch. Most companies have cut cost. And in addition to sort of the workflow changes of going remote, there's a lot of personal challenges that people have been experiencing on the family side, on the health side, on the mental health side, and every company is different. Um, Figuring out how to help a lot of first-time entrepreneurs lead through this really unusual time has been a way that we've more intensely been focused as a team as we rally around those companies. So, who knows how long this will last, and who knows what the environment will look like when people come up for air. But all of those factors have dramatically changed the way that we operate and the way that we prioritize our time and attention as an organization.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned, Aaron, moving faster, Julie, the antenna shift, the ops planning, the ways that you're responding to this, helping entrepreneurs, et cetera. And one thing I'd love to learn more about is, do you think these changes are temporary responses to the time we're in, or do you think that they will have permanent impacts on the ways you're running your businesses, right? From the speed with which you move to the way with which you plan operationally. Curious where your heads are at on that.
I think it's highly dependent upon how long this lasts. So, there's good science around habits get formed based on, the duration in which you have to do something, right? And so, and unfortunately, I don't think COVID's gone away, kind of Tuesday. So it's going to be with us for a while in some form or fashion. And I think for healthcare, the real debate now is not whether or not, for instance, we transition back from kind of telehealth to the old school model of like bringing every patient in for a clinic visit. I think that's here to stay. The question is to what extent does it stick? And what my team is very, very focused on right now is making sure that we do two things. One is we very quickly, in addition to the platform I was telling you about with respect to DexCare, which was really kind of the same day care platform. So if you had something minor and you wanted to get seen kind of on demand or immediately, that's what we were using, or we are using. We also stood up about 7,000 physicians. Our clinical program services team stood up about 7,000 physicians on Zoom kind of overnight. It was kind of very, very quick. And now what we're trying to do is my team is going back and kind of re-engineering that process, working with our clinical and physician services teams to make sure that, okay, so it's going from a necessity to now when it becomes much more optional for both the patient and the provider, they still prefer that mode of care, right? Because right now, like somebody asked me, I was on a call the other day and they said, who could predicted this? And that's absolutely true. But if you had said 6 months ago, what would happen if you shut down all the clinics and you made the pricing of, the reimbursement for a in-person visit and a telehealth visit the same? I would have told you that people would have flipped over to virtual visits, right? I mean, exactly what happened. It's just nobody could have predicted why it happened. And so the question then becomes is now once that constraint kind of falls off and the clinics start to open back up, what you can't have is the backsliding where physicians are like, you know what, this is so clunky, it's so hard to do, and I need to see at least 3 patients an hour, maybe 4. I just can't maintain this, so I'm going to just start asking patients to come back in, right? We can't have that happen. And so that's the big kind of technological fight we've picked right now, trying to make sure that we create an incredible experience in the main part of our business, the scheduled part of our business, to where patients and clinicians don't kind of backslide, you know, at least backslide as little as possible. I don't think it'll ever go back to the very, very small volumes it was pre-COVID. I think if we did nothing, I think it would still be a very high percentage, but we want to limit that as much as possible.
I mean, an analog for that might even just be what's happening with employers in the tech industry right now. Just over the past few weeks, if someone had told you that someone told you in January that the blunt force trauma of this crisis would be so severe that you'd have first, Amazon and Microsoft saying, "Hey, everybody who can work from home should do so through October," and they'd be saying that like in April. You'd be like, that's not going to happen. Or then Zillow would say, "Hey, everyone who can do that should be there through the end of the year." Or yesterday, Twitter saying, "No one has to come in again, ever. Like, you can work from home remotely if you so choose." I mean, just the thought of how quickly that mental shift has happened, what the implications of that will be for how people work, where people get hired, and where they choose to live. I think there's some pretty interesting implications for how we think about urbanization and investment in real estate and lifestyle. I think all of that will be a shift that, certainly at least at Twitter and probably other places that follow, shifts that really stick for a while. Part of the transition for so many in March, was well documented. It was just, oh my goodness, how am I going to figure out how to do this? It just felt so inconceivable that you could both live and work in this way. And to Aaron's point, as you begin to adjust to new norms and new experiences, and you find the tools and resources that enable you to be, if not effective, and certainly effective enough, the way that you see, the way that you spend your time is forever impacted by that. So, we're believers that there will be some very long-lasting changes related to all of those themes that go, well beyond, the crisis, beyond the time that the vaccine reaches scale of distribution, that will stick with us as a society and as a world, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, and I hope, I mean, just personally, I can't tell you how kind of Skinnerianly trained I was to jump on a plane before COVID, to go do some meeting that, like, now I feel stupid because, they could have been done through, video conferencing, and it's a pretty easy, very useful experience. And I just hope future me doesn't forget that and is a lot more judicious, even after a vaccine, and even after we have like widespread immunity, that, just better use of my time, and, and not inflicting this on my family, and of being away so much. So, and I think a lot of people are thinking that way, right? So, just looking back to why did we commute to work, right? Why did we, a lot of these kind of like, I saw a video the other day where it was, it's kind of, they were very clever. They were saying 2020 is all about, hindsight 2020 and perspective and that kind of thing. And so I'm thinking a lot of people are kind of thinking through that. Flip side is there's also a huge amount of economic pain going on in the economy right now.
Yeah, those economic shifts are impacting all, if not most of us. And many of our listeners are not only kind of people dealing with those economic shifts, but they're entrepreneurs and innovators, and they're in consumer tech or they're in healthcare. And we've all got to figure out what to do now and how to make those pivots. So really curious about a bit of a thought exercise on, as these companies and entrepreneurs and innovators are trying to find their place. Maybe they're trying to launch a company. Maybe there's that new consumer need that they see, or a new challenge in healthcare driven by some of these behavior accelerations we've discussed. I'd love to have a conversation about the hypothetical that you two work together again directly. I know you work together at Amazon, but if you were to brain meld and have a eureka moment and build a partnership either between your existing companies or another sort of digital healthcare venture, and then you need to, in a time like this, or even the next 24 months, which are going to be impacted by a time like this, as we've just discussed, you need to grow, scale, and launch that new partnership or new venture. Let's talk about what some of your biggest challenges are going to be, and really what your first step would be in embarking on a venture like that together.
Well, I think the great thing about what we sort of uncovered in talking about our respective models and similarities and differences earlier in this conversation is the fact that the different strengths that we each bring to that process of ideation and innovating more broadly are highly complementary. On one hand, at PSL we've got sort of the sense of that we don't know what we don't know. There's sort of this delicious naivete that we embrace whenever we take on a project in healthcare, and we can do a lot of rapid fire ideation and bring a lot of nimbleness and lack of organizational constraint to bear as we sort of stumble upon both deliberately and by serendipity opportunities in healthcare that could be interesting. We can probably partner really well on complementary talent networks in that world across both healthcare and tech. And as we think about the idea of working, with you, Aaron, it would be, gosh, like, how do we actually know that this has legs? How do we actually take the naivete that we're bringing and test it with real audiences, real customers, real organizations that face the challenges at scale that organizations face all over the world? And to me, that's the kind of thing that yields much bigger opportunities, much more effective opportunities, and a chance to really take something to market that makes sense from the outset.
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, like you, Kelly, I'm a huge Julie fanboy, and so any opportunity to work with her and her team is like, sign me up. But I think you're exactly right. I think you nailed the two things that where health systems have got issues is it is we're typically in our model we're typically recruiting a management team after the product has been built for the most part, after it's got a couple of customers, including us. And so that's a different kind of like recruiting challenge. And it's harder for us to get folks who want to kind of do something kind of from the ground up early on and try out a whole bunch of different ideas. I mean, it's just, we did that with our first EIRs, the Zelf team, and when Mike McSherry and team kind of entered our hallowed walls, they call themselves the free range EIRs. They basically kind of wandered around the health system, trying out different ideas and that kind of thing. And it's hard for us to kind of scale that kind of model to Julie's point, and to really kind of go through the deliberative process of kind of looking at a problem and looking at their proposed solution, and I think you were saying ruthlessly killing it. I think the other thing too that partnering with an incubator is super important to do for health systems is the internal politics. So if somebody has an idea within our organization, um, and this is usually a feature, not a bug, but sometimes it's a bug, which is, we're gonna continue to drive that thing until it's clear that it doesn't work, way past when we probably should. Whereas if you have an organization that is kind of separate and is trying these things out, has much more freedom to kind of ideate and kind of kill ideas quickly, there's less kind of politics wrapped around it, right? In terms of, oh, this is so, and one of my CEOs calls it, this imaginary figure, Dr. Famous, and Dr. Famous has an idea, and you know what? You may want to pursue Dr. Famous's idea for a while, and the evidence, the burden of proof is like guilty until proven innocent. You've got to basically prove that it won't work, which is really really hard to do, right? Um, and so I think the other value that Julie and team can kind of create is the ability to kind of ruthlessly kill ideas that don't look like they're going to work. And then where we would add value is, I always say that the health system or the healthcare industry is a very 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 non hospitable place to startups. And the reason is there's a couple of things. One is the sales cycles. If you love enterprise sales cycles, wait until you get a load of ours. They're exceptionally long. And there's a lot of regulation and there's a lot of domain knowledge that we all know. But the other thing too about it is that you also get a ton of false signal to noise because of the way that health systems are organized still to this day. Providence has evolved a ton over the past 6 years. We're mainly moving to much more of an operating company, but a lot of health systems are federations of smaller pieces. And the challenge is, entrepreneurs can actually get a customer and think they've got signal to noise. And they'll end up having 2 or 3 customers, but they won't get momentum in the industry, if that makes sense. So it's actually easy to get an early customer. It's hard to get momentum in the industry. And so what we do, a lot of what my team does is, once we've got an idea, we've proven that it can work, is we become a channel for it. And so the statistic I always put out there is, over the past 24 months, we've met with 130 health systems, have come to Seattle to meet with us and trade ideas about digital. And when they ask us, how did you solve this problem? We show them the company that helped us solve the problem. And then that creates introductions and it creates momentum, and it kind of speeds things up in the industry from a slow crawl to a faster crawl, right? And so I think that's, we can kind of help take some of the risk out of it, and also give entrepreneurs, when it makes sense, to access to experts and that kind of thing to bounce their ideas off. And I say that when it makes sense, it's not so much to protect our experts' time, it's to protect the entrepreneurs from having their hopes and dreams dashed too early. Because the other thing too is, like, there's a lot of it'll never work in healthcare that happens from time to time. I know, Julie, you'd be shocked to learn that, but
the politics thing is so fascinating, Aaron, because I think it speaks to many of the challenges and unique operating models that you mentioned earlier on, in the sense that you're kind of obligated to explore ideas more deeply than you might if you didn't have the obligation to, right? And Julie, when you kill 9 out of 10 companies or projects, ventures, I mean, the emotional labor of that is high, right? It's not just the idea you're smashing, it's the livelihood, that person's plans, what have you. You just don't have the component Aaron has of having to potentially deal with the repercussions in your continued kind of working model and workday, as an individual. You part ways. And I'm just curious, Julie, given the emotional labor you and PSL endure, having to say no to people's dreams and sunset projects with momentum, what advice would you have to Aaron in terms of how to think differently about the challenge he's facing in his environment, which I'm sure any of our other healthcare innovators can relate to?
It's funny. I don't know that I would have advice, but I would just have sheer empathy and acknowledgement, because without all of the politics and cross-organizational stakeholders and regulatory environment, without all of that, just being a little startup with 20 some people who are all motivated to actually kill these things, like, that's part of what we bake into our entire operating model. Even with all of that, it is still really, really, really hard to walk away. And you do, to your point, Callie, like, you do form emotional attachment to the concept, to the market, to the problem, often to the founder who's come in and shared the idea or have been bleeding and sweating and crying over the idea. It's so, so hard. And that's, I think, one of the things that make successful incubation models fly, when you are able to acknowledge that, even celebrate the fact that that's the reality, but know that in those moments when you do finally come to a decision, whether it's go or no go, that moment in and of itself needs to be celebrated, because just getting to that is so, so hard. I don't envy the challenges that Aaron has to contend with on top of that, but I know that magic is something that we both must be striving for every day.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do, just to kind of counteract the politics a little bit, is something I borrowed. One thing you'll learn from me, Kelly, is, like, there's no original idea coming out of this mouth. I mean, basically, I just borrow shamelessly from anybody who will talk to me, and so where I borrowed this whole concept is from Mayo Clinic, where they they have Dr. Famous in spades there. They literally have people who are world renowned at whatever. And they invent things all the time. And so my counterpart over there was, I asked this person, how do you deal with this situation? And he said, well, it's pretty straightforward. What they do is they say, look, if we're going to basically spin out, and typically for them, it's an invention. So it's going to be like a medical device or something like that. They will say, we'll only put money against that if an external party, like, a Kleiner Perkins or an NEA or somebody like that, leads the round, right? And so they kind of have said, we need an external authority that everybody agrees is an authority in the venture space to basically lead and price that company. And it kind of takes the burden off the internal team to kind of prove or disprove this. And so we've kind of taken a similar approach in our spin outs, which is, step one, we need to believe the product is working. And so we have to demonstrate like financial or clinical value or both. Step two is we then try to sell it to another health system to revalidate that opportunity, make sure it's just not us eating our own cooking. Step three is we have to hire a management team. And so again, as Julie would know, especially we tend to hire very experienced CEOs because these tend to be later stage ideas by that point. And they're making an investment of the next probably arguably 3 to 7 years of their lives. And so if they're going to take on the risk, that's a huge signal to noise that they believe it. And then the last validation step is what we borrowed from Mayo, which is we don't, even though we lead rounds all the time as Providence Ventures of companies that we don't create, for ones that we do, we try not to lead those rounds and price it. We try to get an external VC to kind of come in and revalidate the opportunity. So we put all these countermeasures in place against this very real issue. But even with that, we still, you could conceivably continue on projects that either my team falls in love with, we've done that before, or there's an external party that to my team that's just like really adamant that we got to solve this problem. And so it's not a simple issue.
Well, I'm certainly fascinated by the way both of you are approaching this. I think we've definitely hit on some challenges that are consistent across both of your models, as well as the unique ways that each of you are solving some of those similar challenges. And I love the thumbs ups and the ideas around what it would look like for the two of you to partner. And I hope that if and when that happens, I get a call too. Just, I'll email my phone number because this seems like a super group. But I just want to say thank you both so much for joining us today. This conversation's been fascinating.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. It's been great. Aaron, thanks so much. It was great connecting with you again.
Bye, Julie.
You've been listening to the Think Tank podcast, brought to you by the Digital Innovation Group at Providence Health. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review or follow at Provinnovation on Twitter for more discussion around how digital can inspire solutions to some of our biggest challenges. I'm your host, Kelly Stonelake. Until next time, take care.